Neo, you want to, I guess you're keeping an eye on who's joining us remotely and admitting people as they're getting in.
Exactly. I'll be taking care of anything technical and saying hi in the chat. Hi, Kamal.
So I don't know if everybody got the notification. We're recording the conversation for so that we can share it with folks that might want to check out the exchange from wherever they're at in the world. The sense that I get from Nayo is that people have been really interested in some of the sessions here at Power Skills, and so the session is being shared via Facebook Live, and it'll be recorded and shared through the McGill School of Continuing Studies in the next little while. So I've got 5:06 on the dot on my end. So now's probably as good a time as any to slowly get into things, and other folks will surely join us over the next few minutes. So I wanted to first welcome everyone to this conversation, building meaningful university community partnerships. We've got an hour and a half together to talk about how universities can strive to engage meaningfully with the communities that they belong to. Many of us work for universities or are students at universities, and universities are public institutions. And so how can we honor that commitment to the communities that we're a part of, increase our impact, and make sure that our work responds to and reflects local agency and local priority. We've got three community engaged scholars whose work reflects these values of reciprocity, relationality, and social justice. I gotta say, it's a big treat to be moderating this conversation, given that I've had a chance to work with all three of our presenters over the last few years and to learn from them. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. I'll start before I introduce our panelists. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're all, wherever we're at in Montreal, we're all on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. Tiohtià:ke Montreal is historically has always been a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse array of folks, Indigenous and other peoples. And so in holding this conversation about meaningful and respectful community engagement, we really want to start by respecting this continued connection to the past, present, and future, both in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples and also with all the other folks that call Montreal home. My name's Alex Megelas. I work and live here in Montreal. I live in Rosemount with my family. I study at McGill, and I work at Concordia. And so I'll be the moderator for the exchange we're going to have today. So I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then I'll then ask them to kind of get us into the swing of things. So first off is Alexa Ahooja is a PhD candidate in educational studies in the language acquisition program at McGill and a second language teacher in Montreal in French schools. Her professional experience is in working in institutional contexts, and this has led her to develop a critical stance towards migrant background students' sociolinguistic integration into Quebec schools. Alexa believes that deficit views of these students' identities as multilingual learners are enforced through their French language socialization in schools. Alexa is passionate about social aspects of language learning and is looking for ways to connect her research to communities and their needs. I've had a chance to work with Alexa in the context of the Park Extension Community-Based Action Research Network, and I come to really appreciate her lens as it relates to institutional commitments. Leonora King is a PhD candidate at McGill and an established researcher at the Jewish General Hospital in the Department of Psychiatry. Her research examines the relationship between maternal health, genetic risk, and resilience in young children, and her role as a community-based researcher and outreach worker is to anchor a presence in Montreal's diverse park extension community, build relationships with residents while assessing their needs, empower members of the community, and facilitate collaborations between all participating parties. And I hope that we get to hear from Leonora on the multiple ways in which she manages to develop some strong relational ties with park extension residents. And lastly is Jane Malenfant. Jane is from Kapuskasing, Ontario. She is a Vanier and Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholar, and is a PhD candidate at McGill University's Faculty of Education. They work on issues of institutional access for individuals navigating homelessness and housing precarity, with focus on lived experience and community-led housing solutions and radical housing alternatives. Jane is one of the first scholars that I had a chance to meet when I began my own PhD at McGill. We're both supervised. We were supervised by Naomi Nichols, and I think when I first met Jane, I thought, you know what, this is someone that I like and that I get along with, and she played a big role in making me feel at home at McGill as a PhD student. So just putting it out there. So we'll start by hearing from Alexa, Jane, and Leonora, not necessarily in that order. The question that I would put out to the three of you would be to really introduce yourself, tell us about your work, and really reflect on what it means to commit to meaningful engagement with the communities that you have consistently managed to embed yourself in for over the course of your work. Is there someone amongst the three of you who'd like to go first? Alexa? Thanks, Alexa. So folks will have about 10, 15 minutes each. And maybe I'll send you folks a 2-minute heads up or something like that. And then after we've heard from our panelists, then we'll open it up and we'll hopefully have a nice discussion. So Alexa, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. I hope it's okay with Jane and Leonora if I'm starting first. I'm just an extremely nervous person, and the longer I wait, the worse it gets. So first of all, I'd like to thank Anna, Mayo, and SES for organizing this event today and inviting me to share the floor with two amazing speakers whose work I really admire. And of course, thank you, Alex, for hosting today and also importantly being the link between everyone. My name is Alexa Ahooja. I'm a PhD candidate in education and language acquisition at McGill. I'm also a trained second language teacher of English and French at the primary level of education in Quebec schools. My experience teaching in schools in immigrant neighborhoods of Montreal, such as Park Extension and Côte des Neiges, has made me very critical of the ways migrant background students are being socialized to learn French and through the French language. And when I was teaching French to newcomer students, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the ideological mission I was conferred, and my stance and pedagogical practice as a language educator were often not in line with those of my colleagues, which caused some conflicts sometimes, and also because of the ways I engaged with and encouraged students to use all of the linguistic knowledge that they already had, not only as levers of French language development, but also for identity affirmation. There's no doubt that here in Quebec, because of official language policy, learning French is a prerequisite to accessing future opportunities. But what I observed in schools and through my own experience as well is that French is used in French language teaching is used in education, not only in assimilatory ways, but also is still used as an acceptable means of exclusion and marginalization through linguicism and other also related and embedded processes of discrimination and racism. Education, I think everybody can agree, is a very complex endeavor, but I think that educators and people generally overwhelmingly can agree that its goal should be to foster students' greatest potential holistically. So that means, yes, academically, but also personally. However, the institution of public schools is not impermeable to society's hierarchies. So this implies that minoritized students, such as migrant background students, often face and internalize discrimination for the first time in schools. And so the teaching experiences that I've had have really guided my research interests. And so in my doctoral research, I'm interested in these complex processes and how migrant background students negotiate their experiences of integration as first-time Quebec students and or as also learners of French as an additional language. I'm also interested in their identity constructions and negotiations in schools and at home as they're going through these important transitions. Another aspect of my research concerns the ways integration and students' identities are conceptualized in policy. And so I think that by combining these two aspects together, so one that implies intensive relational work with students in schools, and the other that examines policy documents, I hope to be able to make discriminatory language ideologies that are present in everyday interactions and policy visible through my research. And also, I hope to be able to make connections between what is said in policy and what is actually done in schools. Now, because I'm interested in the institution of public schools, my work is deeply embedded in communities. I think that schools have immense potential to be springboards for essential partnerships with the community because they're typically institutions that receive the widest support of the community. However, because of heavily regulated partnerships within schools through provincial government programs, there's very little grassroots work that can be organized through and with the support of public schools. So partnerships usually arise inorganically from the top without always necessarily responding to communities' specific needs. So for example, in most schools with high populations of migrant background students in Montreal, the government has mandated school boards to collaborate with community organizations to have what they call intervenants communautaires et sociaux, so community workers, to work with families to support their different needs. So these workers can perform tasks ranging from helping families access food banks if needed, centers for employment, explaining ways or how the school system works here in Quebec. So of course, this work is essential in schools because it provides ways to make the homeschool connection or relationship stronger. However, because these workers often are not, are not well acquainted with the school's culture and not entirely included within the institution of schools, there's also a lot of missing pieces there between those two different levels of or actors, if I can say. This is something that I'm still exploring, so I'm very interested to know if anyone else has had any experience with that. So just a little side note. Another thing that I wanted to point is that in addition to that disconnect that I already pointed out just now, the same can also be said about teachers and school staff with the community. And so I have personally experienced this disconnect both as a public school teacher and now as a researcher. And the ways that I've conceptualized my own doctoral project has, from the beginning to now, greatly evolved through better understanding of the importance of reciprocity and closer involvement in the community in order to really be there to listen to what's going on. When I think back to my experience when I was teaching in schools, relationships with families and the community were not valued within the culture of schools. However, I believe that these relationships are essentials and that teachers, along with the systems within which they work, need to prioritize relationship building with the people they're meant to serve. I think that if we want to challenge that paradigm and train teachers to face the real students they will be working with, as well as for current teachers, relationship building with communities and families needs to be central to all of the school actors' work. Now, as an education researcher who wishes to be engaged in reciprocal relational work with teachers, students, and families, I have, however, faced many institutional barriers that have made it difficult for me to access schools. So gatekeepers, such as school boards and universities' ethic boards, are often wary of the type of research I conduct because, in part, it does not necessarily conform to their ideas of what research is and what science maybe should be as well. Now, the ethnographic work that I propose is grounded in relationship building, and research questions emerge from the fieldwork and participants themselves. For example, just to give you a concrete example of what happened when I was submitting applications to the university's ethics board, I was asked to leave out certain aspects of my research. Those aspects were my involvement with the families and supporting them in any way they needed, as well as also providing tutoring services for students, because I was told this is not the goal of my research. I think that research in education with students and their communities needs to be approached keeping in mind the same reciprocal premises that community-based research has been doing. In this case, because the research involves institutions, the relational work involved needs to be done more systemically. So to do so, I think that representatives of institutions, such as university researchers, need to be spending time in schools, communities, to listen, ask questions, observe, and collaboratively address a problem established by all who are concerned. Communities, I don't think communities will come to higher institutions, such as university, to create meaningful relations. So I think it's the duty of powerful institutions such as public schools and universities to do the work and build trust and relations, because these spaces, these institutional spaces, have long and been and still are inaccessible to them. So although today I've pointed out and underlined many problems in education and the way French language teaching is used in schools in exclusionary ways, through my work in schools with students and parents and communities, I've developed a vision of research that is deeply care-based. And I'm hopeful that, and also I will continue to push through the barriers that I've been facing to make schools and language teaching more inclusive. I'm humble, though, at all that I still need to be learning through this process, and in terms of the ways to best serve the interests of the participants that I wish to do research with. I think I'm only at the beginning of my journey, and I still have a lot to learn, as I said. But on one final note, I think that as with any type of relational work, any type of research that you do with human beings, I think that the key is really consistency, care, and listening. So I just wanted to end the presentation like that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alexa. Just as a heads up, in case you want to take full advantage of the interactive options that that we have access to through Zoom, you can, in the lower right-hand corner, you can do the clapping, you can do the thumbs up, and so I'm certainly gonna see Jane's got the ice cream cone that's kind of spewing forth sparkles for some reason. I don't know. Alexa, thank you very much for your presentation. There's a lot that I really want to ask you about. I'll refrain from doing so until we've heard from the other folks, and then hopefully we can have an exchange. Jane, Leonora, who'd like to go next?
I can try. I am out of the city, so if my connection starts to destabilize, I may just turn off the video. That's okay. Can everyone hear me okay so far? Great. Okay. Jane, are you really, really excited to go ahead? Do you want to go?
Go for it. If you can connect, I'm fine.
Okay, I'll take advantage of the connection, and maybe if it cuts out, I'll have you go ahead and I can move to another location. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so yes, my name is Leonora, and today I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that I'm doing, and then also how that's kind of led to some of the work that I'm doing now, and then an example of an initiative that I started in terms of where I was seeing needs that needed to be addressed in the community. So first of all, I am completing my PhD at McGill in psychiatry, where I'm studying the interaction of genes actually in maternal depression in the prediction of resilience in 5-year-old children. And before that, I was studying epigenetic factors as it relates to maternal depression. So although very interesting and very, very, there's a lot of like, I guess, research now that's kind of looking at all these kinds of predictors of mental health to see how we can better identify them earlier on and then design interventions accordingly. I do see this approach as very promising. However, I also at the same time kind of became a little bit disillusioned just by the medicalization and the reductionist approach to mental health, as well as the focus on individual factors that influence mental health outcomes, and the tendency to pathologize individuals in certain communities, particularly vulnerable populations. So for me, I saw that there were broader factors at play, primarily societal, cultural, and political factors. I also saw gaps in implementation and the gaps in terms of the use of strength-based approaches, as well as a lack of social responsibility in how we address mental health problems, actually. And all this in addition to the structural and systemic barriers in place, which make it challenging for certain communities to access services, timely treatment, and other resources. So for me, it was important to kind of not like ignore pathologizing tendencies, because I think that, you know, it can be helpful to identify symptoms and assign treatment. But I felt that some of that tendency, if gone too extreme, can induce, you know, mother blaming, can also induce oppressive dynamics as well, and not really empower the individual. And so I think, especially when it comes to vulnerable communities, that we need to empower them, empower communities, bring out their strengths, and promote their resilience. And I've seen firsthand the healing power that comes with building strong communities, having social support, spirituality, religion, connectedness. And I don't necessarily think we need more research to prove this. We know that it works. We know that community initiatives work. But yet the community sector remains to be one of the least funded sectors. But they're doing some of the most important work with the least resources. And at the same time, I'm seeing more and more research coming out that's kind of validating this intuitive knowledge, telling us about the damaging impacts of isolation across all areas of health. And so for me, this is kind of where I felt the need to just bypass research a little bit and go directly into communities to break this isolation and mobilize support efforts. That being said, I'm doing this with extreme privilege. I'm a fully funded researcher with flexible hours, and I can work independently. I have a generous network, which allowed me to better bridge the divide between the institutions and the community sector. An additional privilege I have is being a second generation immigrant and you know, due to my mother's struggle and her dedication to giving me a better life, I am now in a position to give back. So that for me is really important to me, and it actually is, in my mind, a duty to give back to those who have lived similar struggles as my mother. So I think it's important to devote some of my work and my privilege back, because I would not be in the position I would be in if it wasn't for the struggles of those who came before me. With that, I have used my unique position to work in one of the most vulnerable but resilient neighborhoods in Montreal and in Canada, actually, and to instigate change from the inside instead of waiting for institutions to make an impact. My background has also permitted me to work with these communities in a way that doesn't perpetuate oppressive dynamics, as unfortunately, institutions have a history of exploiting vulnerable populations, not always intentionally. I think a lot of the times we are well-intentioned and we do want to be there to help, but sometimes we're just kind of not in touch with what's actually going on. So by working directly in the community, I can gain a perspective that quite literally comes from the ground up. And oftentimes I've witnessed, as you know, experts, scientists, academics, we can sometimes think we know better. And again, like, even though we're well-intentioned, we tend to offer help in ways that may not actually be reflecting the needs of the people. So in this regard, I think it's best to understand what people need by actually asking them. I know it seems intuitive, but we may not always have the resources or the the connections to do so, right? But even then, before you can even ask people what they need, you also need to understand the context, you need to build that trust, and you need to build the relationships with the people, because if there isn't that trust in those relationships, they may not necessarily tell you what it is that they're struggling with and what they need, right? And also what angle you're coming at it from. So, so that's important, and that takes time. And sometimes we don't always have that time. But if you really want, I think, strong results, and if you really want to have an impact, I think that time investment is necessary. So the way I was able to do this was working through a local community organization. In this case, it was Africo Féminin. And I did my work with them from a place of giving. So although I was technically seeking information, right, like trying to understand what the needs of the community were, I do understand that the community organizations are kind of already stretched and they're always being asked for things from all angles. So I wanted to offer my help in a capacity that allowed me to integrate into the community at the same time. And in doing this, I came to know many women who came to the center, and over time, I was able to cultivate relationships with them and build trust, while also acquiring a better understanding of the cultural and societal context to address the needs of the community. I came to understand that many families were living in poverty, and with this particular population, largely because of their precarious immigrant status, which prevented them from finding work and accessing certain services. And without stable sources of income, how can we really expect these communities to strive and overcome certain barriers? So that's kind of where we really need to work with communities as well, is to kind of just dissolve some of those barriers if possible. So I came into contact with many women who wanted to work but couldn't because they didn't speak the official languages, they didn't have their PR status, their permanent residency status, or work permit. And at the same time, especially during the pandemic, was realizing that domestic violence was a huge problem in the community. And so there was also a very urgent need to equip women with more financial independence so that they could increase their mobility and not depend on their spouses who often sponsor them. And so it is out of my involvement with working with the community that there's an initiative that I started, and I can maybe share it with you, where the Park X Curry Kitchen was born. So if I have I can just share with you quickly, if I have permission. Let me see if that works. Great, can you guys see that? Yeah, okay, perfect. So for this initiative, basically it's a mutual aid initiative that provides a means of financial support for women in the Park Extension neighborhood who are unable to work because of their precarious immigration status, as I mentioned before. But they all happen to be amazing chefs, and they're all like kind of staying in their home and cooking anyway. So it was an amazing opportunity. I saw women that were amazing cooks, and during that time too, when a lot of restaurants were still closed, you know, people needed to eat. I saw an opportunity to connect a demand and is it service, a need? Yes. So I coordinated a weekly catering service where people in the Montreal area were able to purchase very reasonably priced home cooked spicy meals that would then go to support these women who were cooking in their kitchens. And so I started doing that the end of April. And I don't know if I could show the next page. And so this is kind of just a little snapshot at kind of what the initiative looks like. These women who are all refugees or non-status women who cooked, and I just arranged this menu that where people can order every week, and yeah, and then basically just created jobs for these women, empowering them at the same time, and having them play a role in their community and doing what they love, which is feeding people. So that was just one way that I kind of used my position and somewhere where I saw a need to create this this initiative. So I think sometimes, you know, we have to think creatively about solutions and innovatively. So for me, that was where I kind of, yeah, I kind of just thought about this, got a little bit of feedback, and people were like, yeah, this is a great idea. I'll support it. And so, and since then, I've been able to raise about or distribute almost $5,000 to women who can't otherwise work, and it's still going strong and it's still expanding. So yeah, and it's just been such a heartwarming initiative. So I'm really happy to also have the support from various institutions actually, and community organizations who have also made this possible. So I think that's all I have to present, and I'm happy to take any questions during the question period.
Thanks a lot, Leo. Yeah, I'm gonna do my hand clapping reaction. When you were describing Park Exterior Kitchen, my mouth started to water, and that's because when Leonora started the initiative, my family were able to benefit from the service that you provided. I think for maybe a couple of months or something, and it was just such a relief on Saturday night to get the food after, you know, I don't know if any of you have kids, but when you've got kids, the weekends are sometimes they're a bit go-go, and so Saturday night it's such a nice treat to get to see Leonora, get the food, and to kind of dig in. So it was such a great initiative. So we'll go on to Jane now, and then afterwards we'll open it up.
Okay, I have so many questions for both of you. That was awesome. And I think a lot of this will hopefully, I guess, mesh well together. And so, yeah, I'm Jane Malafa. I currently live and work in Chochage, and I'm a PhD candidate at McGill in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, which is very long. And as Alex mentioned, my research and overall work primarily focuses on education and youth homelessness, and that includes barriers to post-secondary education. I also want to talk today from a position of having been one of the people who started the LiveX network, which is a small network within the Making the Shift Social Innovation Hub, but it's a network of scholars with lived experience of homelessness, some who are graduate students, some who are community researchers, some who are interested in getting engaged in research, to create kind of peer-led supports for doing work in universities as people who have experience of homelessness. And so I also want to begin echoing some of the challenges of doing this work. I think of people who are in the network with me universities are often very violent spaces for them, and they see their university work, if they're there, as very separate from being able to share and ground their knowledge in their community and what they do outside of the university. So I really try to do work that bridges these or brings things across these barriers in really intentional ways. I also begin all of my work grounded in my own lived experience. I experienced homelessness as a teen, and I now work with youth who have experienced or are experiencing homelessness. And our experiences are often different as we are also experiencing other intersecting institutional stuff. But one thing that there is a trend with youth who have experienced homelessness is that post-secondary is not really presented as an option. So in my research, I hear the same story of what happened to me. I got kicked out of school like 3 times because the symptoms of homelessness are often seen as just kids being bad or things to be punished or reasons to push students out. And students face discrimination. And also, yeah, it's barely presented as secondary graduation being an option. Post-secondary just like often was not presented to the youth that I work with. However, there's so many reasons why they might want to engage in university spaces. So at the same time, I see these groups of young people as being heavily researched by people in universities. So youth who are experiencing homelessness in particular, but also youth who are struggling with mental health issues, Indigenous youth, youth of color, newcomer youth, who are all overrepresented in groups of youth experiencing homelessness and over-researched and I think underrepresented in who is doing the research. So I heard the same thing in what you were saying, Alexa. A lot of young people I work with want to go to university so they can become social workers or they can become educators so that they can kind of work in their communities. Leonora, I think similar to what you were saying as well, they want to go to post-secondary. There's so many barriers to accessing those spaces. So I enter also thinking of this work and university spaces being something that I hadn't imagined myself, even though in many ways I think I do fit the norm of who is an imagined student or who is an imagined researcher in academia. But through experiences of housing precarity, I had like an atypical trajectory to get here. And so I try to keep that in mind in everything I do and who I bring into these spaces when I'm trying to bridge, what I see as my community and university work. But I also wanted to talk today about how this is like really complex and tough work. So I also ground everything in my lived experience and these tensions I have felt for a long time as someone who's been in academia for a while. And I wanted to talk about like the tensions between access and resistance or refusal. So when I started going in and working with Dans la Rue, which is an organization that serves youth experiencing homelessness in Montreal, I was working in the day center and I went in not really having experienced stable housing for very long myself. And I was like, smash the system. The university is terrible. Like, we're going to do it all by us, for us. We're going to do community-based, like action-oriented, activist research, which I still really stand by a lot of that. But in realizing how I was entering this space, both identifying as someone who had these shared experiences and came from a particular community of people and who my peers were still part of often, I also had access to McGill. And as Leonora was saying, I had scholarships, I had research funding, I knew how to write academically and access these spaces in a way that many of the young people I was working with couldn't. So I took a few steps back and thought, like, what does it really mean to invite community into academic spaces? What does it mean to reflect on the power dynamics in how I'm positioning myself and how I'm talking about we, and what parts of we I am in different spaces? So to give an example, while some of the young people I work with absolutely did not want to come to McGill University for many reasons. It's a very colonial institution. It's a very exclusive institution. It's physically up the hill. So many young people I worked with were like, no, thank you. I have no interest in doing this. But some young people I worked with really, really thought it was something special, that they could say they were a researcher at McGill, that they could come and work in our office and access that space because it was a kind of elite space where elite knowledge lived that they were then being able to participate in ways that they didn't think they'd be able to. And similar to what I experienced when I started entering university spaces, the community knowledge that we had and knew was all of a sudden framed in a way where people would listen to it as expertise. So I could bring youth that I was working with into a conference and have them speak the same things that they were talking about with their peers and see it kind of recognized as like data or knowledge in a particular way. And so I say this particularly thinking how to build university spaces differently, research that is relevant and supports communities. These two things I think have to be held at the same time, that universities are historically and continue to be violent spaces for a lot of communities, that they're inaccessible spaces, they're ways of maintaining privilege and material access in particular ways. And so we must be ensuring material and emotional supports for students who are coming in who have historically been excluded. But also we have to do the work of changing those structures and cultures and expectations and biases and stigmas that shape who enters university spaces. And once people do enter, that they, whether or not they feel supported and safe, and that their knowledges, maybe based in their experiences and based in community, don't have to be squished down in order to access, you know, acceptable academic hierarchies of knowledge. And so a few things that I was thinking of what that looks like. So representation being a huge thing that isn't enough, but a really big part of this, I think of the LiveX network. Many people have said just hearing me talk about my experiences has allowed them to bring their experiences into their research in different ways. And that to combat the kinds of objectification of sitting in a conference room and looking at stats about your community. You know, I've sat in a conference room and had been like, you know, this many people die on the streets. And I'm like, I know those people. Those are my loved ones. So being able to create space, I love that Alexa and Leonora, you were talking about care and giving, because I think research should be doing that stuff and should also be acknowledging that people aren't data and that these aren't separable in that way. Tokenism, I think when we're thinking of bringing community into university spaces in really tangible and concrete ways, Marie Baptiste in Decolonizing Education talks about like add and stir, in particular in terms of Indigenous education being added to settler colonial schools, and that it doesn't work because you're not changing the structure to allow the valuation of knowledge, knowledges that have historically been excluded or invisibilized or devalued. So not just adding and stirring, but actually changing the structure. And then I think the recognition of material realities of people. So many times when I started out, I was working like 6 jobs and I'd hand in my pay sheet and someone would be like, oh, there was an error, you're not getting paid. And I was like, well, I can't pay my rent if I don't get paid. So the assumption that in post-secondary in particular, that students are also members of communities, but they also might be materially precarious. Post-secondary student homelessness exists. So the assumption that people are coming into spaces with certain material things or finances, I think is something easy to address, not easy maybe, but something to address. And then I think, yeah, creating structures that follow the changes we want to see. So something that I have really brought into my work from like an anarchist idea of thinking is bringing in those mutual aid structures, bringing in structures that try to model what we want to see differently and not kind of seeing research as a means to an end, to something that we want to see in the future, but that we can be doing this each and every day. And I think that's also complex because some people in universities and communities have more power and privilege. So it might be safer for them to speak out against something. I'm timing myself, Alex. And so I think that's a bunch of stuff. And I'm really looking forward to chatting about any of it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jane. And I gotta say, when you're just to reiterate that it was just so important to me to see your interests reflected in reflecting my own when I kind of stepped in, and it was a big part of what made this okay as a process. Yeah, thanks to all 3 of you for starting us off and throwing some really awesome perspectives on how to do work from a position of care, from a position of allyship, without falling into the pitfalls of existentialism and caricaturization, but rather by embracing fully the complexity that everyone deserves to hold, either individually or in the context of the communities where they live, and that we seek to enter to do our work as academics. I got a whole bunch of questions that I'd be curious to ask you. Given that I'm moderating, I'll give myself the permission to ask one, and then we'll kind of open it up. The piece that I'd be really curious to get your thoughts on is, can you give us an example, maybe each of you, of how you've been able to build trust with the communities that you that you sought to base your work out of? What does that look like concretely for you folks? I won't pick on anybody. Just I'd be curious to hear from you folks on that. Is there anybody that might want to have a whack at it?
I can go ahead. Sorry, I just have my video off, but can you hear me? Great.
Yes, we can.
So one of the things I think for me to build trust, I had mentioned already, was time. And the other thing, I don't know if we necessarily touched on it, but I think it's important. I realize it's not always possible, but whenever people in the community are also seeing people that look like you, right? So I think sometimes it's scary. You have people coming in, you don't know really like what languages they speak, what their cultural background is, if they're going to understand the same issues as you. So I think for sure a big part was me actually looking like the people I was working with. And so I think that representation is important. But I do realize it's not always possible. And in that case, it's important to have allies, or to have maybe translators, or to even just take the time maybe to just understand those cultural pieces if they are a factor. Yeah, and listening, a lot of listening, and less telling. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Thanks, Leo.
Mhm.
And
I
just
would-
to highlight, actually, Leo, that I remember hearing you say very clearly the extent to which you acted as a broker when I began to do work with Africo Féminin, you know, in the
Right.
context of that conversation series that we organized together around healthcare access. You know,
Right.
you played that role, and it was a very big part of what allowed me to do other types of projects with those folks afterwards.
True. Yeah, just partnering with people that that the people already do trust, right? It's definitely a way to get in as well. Yeah.
Jane, I think you were about to jump in. I cut you off.
I definitely was, and I can't, but I was going to echo time. I think that's the thing that I've said again and again and again. When people ask me, how do you engage people with lived experience of homelessness, which is, you know, a diverse group. Lots of people experience homelessness in different ways. I think time is important also because that's often something researchers don't have, and academics are like, I'm working all the time, and oh my God, I'm so busy. And so to like actually sit and spend time with people and build relationships and get to know them and share pieces of yourself isn't often factored into how universities value time. And I think I would also add that a lot of academics feel precarious themselves in their positions. So to take the time to do that really important work of trust building isn't always prioritized. But I would say, like, you know, I help people move. I like eat food. Like, I think those kinds of things are things that you should be doing to build community, and that shouldn't be, again, a means to an end, which is eventually getting like juicy data. It should be to build a strong community of trust that goes both ways, or every way.
Yeah, and just to kind of acknowledge that people are more than what we seek to engage with them with. You know, I think people are just as complex as we are. They like cartoons, they watch Netflix, they, you know, they have their favorite foods, the stuff they dislike, and so it's important to kind of hold those inquisitive lenses and, like, I don't know, it's been a good yarn. Alexa, what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
building
well,
trust?
yeah, I think I really agree with Jane and Leonora. Time, listening, doing basic human stuff that you do to connect with anyone. I mean, people and participants and whatever you want to call them, they're human beings. So I mean, the same way you would want to connect with someone else, I think are the ways that I would privilege, and I would like to be able to create connections with people that I would like to do research with. In my case, I've unfortunately, because this is not the angle that I wanted to go with, unfortunately, I've realized that people seem to, or people or immigrant families, I think they value very much so my training as a second language teacher. And so what I realized is that offering help as much as I could, not only with like tutoring their children, of course, but also even like conversational French classes with the adults. And that's a way that I found to connect with parents during the pandemic, because all of these things were I also had more time because we were able to do them online. And so I was able to get involved with a few community organizations and spend time with parents, adults wanting to learn French, and building relationships that way, and maintaining contact as well. I mean, it was not in person, but it still, I think, made a lot of sense, because I was able to establish some relationships, and we're still in contact now. And it has no use for my actual research. Like I'm not going to be able to do anything with that, but it was just a way for me to feel like I'm engaging in the community and also doing the work. But I have to say that without the pandemic and having more time, and I think that Leonora said that also, I don't know if it was today or another day, but without the pandemic allowing me to have more time to do those things, because they were online, and I could hop on 3 meetings in the same day, you know, instead of having to travel at different neighborhoods in Montreal. It really allowed me to build those relationships like that. And so providing them with what they were asking from me, which is practice my French, help me, you know, understand this, or tutor my child. So yeah.
So folks, we'll open it up. You know, if you've got a question, you can either put it in the chat. We have one already that I'll read out. If you want to raise your hand, you know, we can also turn on your mic and you can ask it yourself. For now, Leith Hamilton put a question in the chat. I'll just read it out. So this is to everybody. How can you address policy issues that communities have little resources to pursue? There's also, Leith says, communities must be tired of universities studying them without receiving direct benefits. How do you balance power disparities? And then there's a second question. Do you know of university community partnerships that build community capacity to promote social change? So anybody want to tackle that one?
I can start. Oh, Leonora, okay.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Because this is something that I ask all the time as well. And I think the power dynamic, power imbalances, and the question around policy and capacity to work on policy issues are really implicated in my mind. And one thing that I think of is during the past year, how hard it has been to be working kind of frontline wise, to be losing a lot of members. You know, there's a drug poisoning crisis. Like, I think anyone who has been working in the spaces that I've been working in, who also has peers and loved ones in those spaces, I'm a researcher, but I'm also exhausted from grief and loss. And so I think in my mind, the policy piece is something I try to really do. I go in and I if I'm doing an interview with youth, I don't say we're going to solve homelessness, or I'm going to tell the government this and then they're going to change something. I try to say, we're going to try to create ways that we could show for ways for policy change, but also that policy change isn't enough. But I also would say that this is a question, I know ally is a really bad word and a tricky word, but I've experienced people who don't have to also carry that emotional labor and grief of working in a community where people you love are dying all the time. And so to be able to ask people who have a bit more capacity to do some of the work that you might not have access to, like I do policy stuff, but it's only been a couple of years where I even understand how any of it works. So I think having people that you can touch on to do work when you are just exhausted is a really important part of community work. And then the people you're working with in addition to that are often even more impacted. Like, so to me, it's a question of who has the capacity to do that work. And what is your responsibility to moving things forward in the way that still honors what community members want, but doesn't put all of the onus on them to be doing it, I guess. Yeah, I just think allyship is a terrible thing often and how it's brought up, but to put the onus on doing some of that work on people who have more access and power and maybe space to not be actively grieving all the time.
Leo, you were going to jump in before. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
Sure. I mean, I'll address two things. I mean, for the policy thing, I still see challenges with that. Unfortunately, I think that's where my place in the academic institution is, where I can have more of that influence. So unfortunately, data does talk to policymakers. Publications do talk to policymakers. So I do have my foot in that door as well. And so I think the effort is more just trying to bring that data from the community to the institutions and then to the policymakers. At least that seems to be the most the easiest way. I know there are other ways, and as Jane was talking, you know, like allies possibly with political allies could be a possibility. But for me, that's kind of how I've navigated that. In terms of the question about, you know, community organizations kind of being exhausted with institutions kind of always coming to them to study them, I am very much aware of this and the history, and also even for participants who, you know, give their time and then don't see anything coming back to them in terms of actual impact and change. And, you know, we basically interrogate the hell out of them. And they think, you know, we come at them with this approach that, yes, this is for the community, we're working on this, we're working on that. A lot of this like academies, is that the the term, you know? But then we don't see that impact. But I do see, so Alex, I'm grateful for example, for the CBAR network, which is the community-based action research network in ParkX, where we are trying to actively, you know, push researchers and other people who want to get involved in the community to really just ask them, how can this help? What can you do to help us? It's not just about what you want here. Sure, you have your project, you have your research mandate, but you also do have to recognize that if you're you know, taking from an already under-resourced place, that you really also need to be thinking about balancing that power and how you can, I guess, give back. So, I mean, like I mentioned before, even just going to these community organizations and asking how you can help, how you can be of service. And speaking with them in terms of their research experience, their past experience with researchers and how that experience has been. I think there are more efforts to balance that out, but I think there's more work to be done. I don't know if I exactly answered the question, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that was a good one, Leonora. I think it's to me, it really illustrates just kind of the tensions that happen when you've got researchers who want to impact communities that they don't belong to, they've never necessarily lived in, or want to, you know, tackle social issues that they've never experienced themselves, like poverty, racism. So there's big gaps that are at play. Right. We've got another question in the chat that I'll read out. If you want to, you know, pick up the mic and talk live, that's also an option. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So in the chat, we have, what can university community partnerships do regarding minor sports associations? Are there any training courses for members related to minor sports? I sit on the board committee and would love to get the other members to be more aware and informed on what their responsibilities are and their role, also on how to deal with conflict and decisions. I'm aware of the McGill Future of Sports Conference. So there are folks, either the panelists or other people who might have suggestions on how to, you know, look at community university partnerships, but through the lens of sports for
Maybe would it
Okay.
be possible to get a little bit of background on what the minor sports associations is, or what it does?
Okay, well, we can also just park this one. So the person who asked the question, if you want to maybe expand on your question, from knowing the presenters, it doesn't surprise me too much that this isn't something that's generating a hot pickup. But just, I've got a couple of thoughts about it myself, just coming at sports through anarchist organizing in the past. But it's not really too related to what we're talking about here. So maybe what I'll do is I'll put my email in the chat, and if the person who's asking the question ever wants to riff off about how to connect sports to social change, that certainly was my jam when I was younger than I currently am, and when I was playing soccer sometimes twice a week, and really feeling, you know, those social justice commitments on the pitch. Corey, you got your hand up. You want to turn on your mic and ask your question?
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, great. I was just wondering, I think of university research students coming in, there's a lot of transitional aspects to the, you know, coming in and doing research. So we're talking about, some of us have lived here, have already come into this research because we're part of communities. Some of us are trying to build those relationships throughout the research process. But one aspect, and I know none of you are, as far as I can tell, in this situation right now, but have you thought about, or have any thoughts about what it means to close a process? Like, if you know, you're in these communities and your relationship inevitably will change, whether your research shifts or you move on to different things, and you might even leave the city. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about, I don't know if you go through an ethics process around this, but even just around how to close, you know, close research and leave communities. And do you have ideas of how you're going to start that process if you are going to be, you know, leaving the communities that you're currently working with? Thanks.
Wow, that's a really great question. And I don't want to answer it because I'm so scared of thinking about that. And I guess in my case, like, I'm pretty much stuck. I'm I'm there for as long as I can't even think about leaving the community, because I think now I've kind of come in beyond research, and also I think this, maybe it's something personal to me as well, because it's like I come from the same cultural group, so I kind of feel tied to making some like impact and some change. But wow, if I've had to, I guess, yeah, one day it's true, I'll have to think about that. And the only way I can think about that is like is just trusting that I'm putting my work, those connections that I've created, the projects that I've started, into the trustful hands of someone else, and making sure that, you know, I've spent a good amount of time maybe training that person, having that person come along with me for the ride, to then be able to, because I think, you know, our communities, they see already, I wouldn't want to perpetuate like that constant abandonment, you know, of people coming in and leaving constantly. I think that hurts communities, and I think it makes them more distrustful, as it is, of institutions and researchers. So I think that's something that it's not. So yeah, maybe just making sure that, I don't know if there is a formal process for this. I'm interested to see what Jane or Alexa, if there is a process, research, where you.
Leo, just a heads up, you keep cutting in and out.
Okay, I'll let someone go ahead in that case.
Alexa, Jane, do either of you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, if I can just say a few words, I think just like Leonora, I think this is a really good question, something that probably I should have given more thought to. I'm still at the beginning of my research process, so this is not something that I've envisioned yet, having to leave the community. Of course, ideally, I would say I don't want to be doing that. That's not the kind of approach or way that I would want to be doing research. However, certain circumstances can change, and I mean, I could have to move to another city or be in a different position where I can't be as involved or in the community. However, that's not the hope. But what I'm thinking, the one thing that I'm thinking that might, I don't know the method or methodology or the way that closing the research project or the closing the relationship of the project, because they're human beings. So I don't know how that ends, like if there's an actual endpoint. But I would say that carrying on the in terms of advocacy work, I think that should never end. And that's the whole, I think the whole point of why I would want to be involved with these communities. So yeah, that's all. That's what I was thinking.
I have something to say. Today, I actually had one of my last meetings with one of the youth researchers on this project. I would say start thinking of it now, because I also had not thought of it. Because in one sense, you want to maintain just like relationships, and in another sense, funding also paid all of the young people who showed up to work. So it has been in the last year kind of a balance between making sure they're getting paid, making sure that I'm meeting kind of my responsibilities to them in terms of writing stuff up and you know, trying to find ways to do advocacy stuff. But then also knowing that at a certain point, our money would run out, and I would then have to, in any case, expect them to just come and hang out with me as like a person. And so for me, it was really difficult because I've been prolonging it for a long time. But today I sat with one of my youth researchers who was visiting from Ontario, and we just sat on the grass, and I was like, so what's up? And we went through like, what would this have looked like differently? What kinds of things do you still want to do? And how can I make sure that you're still able to be involved in the ways that you want? Like, what do you wish that we could write? Like, what kind of stuff do you really importantly want to get out? And so like, I'm also working on a zine project. I'm trying to find funding to do different things. But for me, that piece that is really tricky is maybe moving away, and you sever those ties. But in really practical terms, how is the funding and your role sustainable? Because I've also seen projects where, oh, the grant is done with no notice, all of a sudden a bunch of young people have no more jobs, and they don't know necessarily what happens after that, because the academics like go away into their layers and write papers or something. And so I think like what we started at the start was like, this is when things are ending, and we renewed the contracts, but like the professional relationship and like the material things, and then the other aspects of the relationship, I think are complex and are interconnected in different ways. But to me, that's been really tricky to navigate, because I want them to just work on this forever because they want to keep working on it. But I'm going to finish my PhD, and so I can't. So I think it's a really important question, and it's one that people don't think about enough, because it can have really bad, like Leonora was saying, if you just leave people who are often having people just drop in all the time in their lives, that can be really devastating. So I've been thinking a lot about it today, because I feel like a chapter is ending in my research, and it's sad.
And that's it. And it's a really crucial piece, I think, that allows us to really critique some of the presumptions that are well entrenched in academia. The idea that when we drop in students that are doing that need to do a bulk of placement hours, that they'll be able to contribute meaningfully to community organizations that are on the ground. And there's something that's just deeply unsettling about what's taken for granted in that relationship, that we can tap community groups and to assign them an educational mandate that they never really signed on for in the first place, and to expect and to promise that in return, the students that will be with them for 40, 50, 120 hours are going to contribute meaningfully. When I used to work in community groups, we used to welcome these students because we were maxed out. We were beyond capacity. We didn't have the capacity to do that work. And so there was that expectation or that hope, that someone would come in and be able to contribute, and it was about 50-50, and so half the time, folks would show up and it was a good exchange, but the other half, you're like, all right, well, that was kind of a waste, but that's something that we don't talk about in the context of university. And so we tend to really, really overpromise and underdeliver across the board. But this is really one example. So I see, we've got about 15 minutes. We've got a question from Leith. I just want to maybe see if there's anybody who hasn't asked any question who'd like to jump the queue. And then otherwise, we'll go to Leith, and then I'll just really encourage folks to step up and share their thoughts or questions with the time we have left. Anybody who hasn't spoken just yet? Okay, go ahead, Leith. I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I mean, I love what everybody's doing, but I was hoping, we could spend some time, doing some critical thinking about university community partnerships, especially like there's a lot of rhetoric going around in terms of what university community partnerships, what's the vision, how they benefit. It's like the new flavor of the month. Let's partner with communities. But in reality, I'll use an example. The University of Ottawa got a boatload of money to do research around profiling, racial profiling, homeless, blah, blah, blah. And they got really lambasted because they tried to partner with community groups here in Montreal. They got money, but they had no relationships with these communities. They had nobody on their team that were people of color, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a whole group of people that, criticized the way the Social Research Council funds. The funding patterns for university researchers is very distorted. It's not really able to create, look at the disparities between universities and communities. That's one. And secondly, the idea of university community partnerships really has not addressed what we call community engaged pedagogy. How does these researchers and these universities empower communities to assume some leadership role for their own knowledge? Instead of communities being passive sponges of knowledge and whatever it is, and then as some of the participants said, after the research money is gone, these young people go, the research is, maybe a year later you get a study, the PhD people are going back into their world, but nothing ever changes. And I've been involved in communities for a long time, and this is my criticism, is that university community partnerships really are paradoxical in the sense that they promote the status quo. There's really not, I would say, a priority in terms of the universities working with communities where they're emphasizing social change. Universities live right close to disadvantaged areas, neighborhoods, poverty, and they did so for years, and they've never, it's only been now, with Black Lives Matter and homelessness and Indigenous, that they've discovered community. And it's the Indigenous community. Kanawaki has an MOA, an agreement with Concordia. And if you look at that contract between for research, community-based participatory action, it's very, very radical. They won't go for half of the stuff that's going on. I'm just doing it as critical thinking so that we as a collective group can look at what works, what's failing, and what could be improved in this kind of collective discussion.
Thanks, Leith.
Yeah, I would maybe say a couple of things. Yeah, Leith, I appreciate your critical thinking on this. And I don't even know if we have like a solution to this, except for maybe having someone in between, like a liaison who can work with the institution and the communities. Because honestly, what I've seen from an institutional level is that, you know, it's a hot topic to be working with vulnerable communities. It's a hot topic to be studying resilient communities. And so I see a lot of researchers, you know, applying for these grants and saying that they're going to do this work with the community, but it's they get the grant money, and then I see that on a superficial level, yes, they're kind of going into the communities and collecting this data, but it's really not in a way where I feel that it's genuine. You know, I really feel like it's like they're using all these buzzwords, they're getting that grant money, and I have yet to kind of see it impact communities in a really, yeah, I would say authentic way. So I don't actually have a solution there, except to maybe challenge those researchers who are, you know, getting the funds to go in and study communities, but from what lens and for what purpose, and what's the gain, what's their approach. So yeah, I'm just kind of sharing that in terms of what I've seen at the institutional level. And it, it hasn't looked too promising. That's why I've kind of taken matters into my own hands.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go for it, Jane.
Because I absolutely agree. And I think my question is often like, why universities at all? Why can't communities do their own research? Why can't community members like be equipped to, if research is something important, to carry out research in community, by community? And I think that the way that universities are structured right now, you can't actually have like true, you know, good community university partnerships because the needs of the community are never important to the university. But one thing I've been pushing for, and I am sitting on some like funding tables and stuff, and I've been trying to, I've seen the actual boxes getting checked and that it's just a box. And so one thing I've been trying to push for is assessment, of having someone in these funding bodies or in the project to assess the impacts on people. So in the, if people with lived experience of homelessness are being asked to be advisors or consultants or participants, at the end of the project, can they have a say in how harmful this research was? And so building that into how we do research, because otherwise you can say, this was a community engaged project and we consulted with blah, blah, blah. But in reality, there's no actual mechanisms for evaluating whether or not that was actually successful, whether that shaped the project in important ways, or whether it actually harmed communities. And that's more of my concern, that I've seen so many projects where these partnerships actually lead to more harm. So in my mind, I think significant changes, but in the meantime, assessment that is led by community of how research is being done, and then looking at things like CBAR, or ways where communities say, this is what we actually want. If you're going to come in, you have to pitch to us. Like I've seen organizations develop that stance, but when you're really like low on staff, of course, yeah, you're going to say like, well, if you can help out. So I think assessment and not just saying you're doing something, which is what universities are.
Thanks, Jane. I think a lot of that have seen that pattern of folks that drop in, you know, tap people's time for a meeting, and then afterwards say, yeah, I consulted. And it's meant to be kind of a hand wavy pass at whatever comes next, and no commitments to transparency and no commitments to accountability. So we gotta be aware that that's a weird little magic trick. Go ahead, Alexa.
No, sorry, I just wanted to add, because this is exactly what Jane just pointed out, is that the work, such as like the work that we do at CBAR, that gatekeeping mechanisms that we try to put in place so that researchers don't come with their extractive kind of approaches to research and all those things. Perhaps that also needs to be done within the universities with community members who are paid by the universities to do those kinds of things, who are then also making researchers accountable right at the very start of the research process. When I was talking about my difficulties getting access in terms of the ethics board, in much of the same way, but in terms of giving the power instead of, or in addition to the ethics board, to the community, by giving them those positions of power in universities and money. I mean, you need to give them money. You need to provide the material means to be able to make those things possible. Yeah.
So folks, we got about 5 minutes left. I think I'd really like to close with just a last go around with our panelists, and just to really ask them, like, what are the things that you're hyping these days that you want people to know about? But before, so I'm just kind of putting that as a prompt so you folks can think about that ahead of me actually asking the question. But before we get there, anybody else want to throw out a point? Maybe somebody who hasn't spoken just yet. Here's your chance. Okay. So then, yeah, let's move to a quick closure go around. And yeah, just I'd be really curious to know, like, what are the things that you want folks that are still on the call to go and check out, and the things that really jazzes you up right now. Anybody want to go first?
Is it like totally inappropriate to do a shout out for the Park X Curry Kitchen? And if you want to buy home cooked Indian meals from refugees, to contact me, you can email parkxcurrykitchen@gmail.com, and I will deliver to you home cooked meals. And also just thank you, Alex, and to Anna for organizing this panel, and for Concordia also for taking a step in this direction. I think to think more about these community and institution partnerships. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Leo. Alexa, Jane, some closing thoughts?
I think I echo that you should check out Park X Curry Kitchen, because that sounds rad. I don't have anything. I think if people know of anyone who might want to join the LiveX network, I encourage you to share. I can share the email or the website. Anyone can join. There's free resources, and particularly for people doing homelessness research. But I also just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you, Anna, for organizing. It's really exciting that we can have these conversations, and it's unfortunate we're all on the same page, but I think it's really cool that this is being talked about more and more and more, because I think that there is potential to research, and there is potential to, like, universities, if we can change things up. So it's really awesome to talk with everyone tonight.
Thanks, Jane. I think I like to view these spaces as this really awesome move towards critical mass, and I do believe that what we're seeing is a sea change in how post-secondary education moves away from just, really striving to put out some lip service to engagement, to actually, listening to some of the folks that are here on the call, and towards making substantial changes. Alexa, some closing thoughts on your end?
No, I think also I just want to say again, thanks for inviting me. I'm really honored to have been able to share the floor, as I said, with Jane and Leonora. I really admire you guys' work, and you guys are really truly inspiring, and the conversation that you've and the thoughts that you've shared today are really gonna help me, I think, further my thoughts and try to make me a better person and researcher. So thanks.
Okay, folks. So I guess we'll close it here for now. I would encourage you to have a look at the rest of the panels that are organized as part of the Paris Skills Conference, which is put on by the School of Continuing Studies at McGill University. I'd like to thank as well, all of our panelists, Alexa, Jane, and Leonora, for sharing their experiences. I want to thank my partner Anna for giving me the chance to spin a good yarn with these folks, and also to her colleague Nayo for holding the fort on this one. yeah, it was certainly appreciated. So here's wishing you a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was awesome. I was kind of in and out because Anouk's not feeling well, but this was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you,
Now we have a recording somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have a reporting. You want the emails, I guess.
The
Would
email.
Would it be for the emails, or what kind of reporting would you like?
Oh, just the recording of the session, so I can
yeah.
listen to it again.
Yeah, for sure. So it should be ready tonight. We normally send it a few days after, but
Oh, no rush. I think you all like need to go like on vacation or something after Power Skills. So whenever you have a chance, I would
well,
I
thank
would
you so much.
appreciate.
I learned a lot, and I really love all the research and work that you guys are doing. Sorry, now we can be ourselves. No more, no more